Okay, so this is chapter 2 of Computing Professions and Professional Ethics. Um, these slides are prepared by me. So let's just review what we're going to be doing in this chapter. We have some objectives we want to talk about, what the definition of a profession is, what are professional ethics, and where do they come from, and why should we follow them. In doing this, we're going to be looking at what I refer to as cases similar to what we did in Chapter 1. We're going to be looking at different situations, particularly in IT domains, and what they are. They're like little puzzles for us to analyze to see what we would do in ethical situations and what should the person do who is in the scenario. We're going to practice discussing and sharing our views. And what I would like to do is make sure we avoid arguments. So when we were talking, for example, on our online sessions, we're not arguing, we're trying to discuss and find common ground eventually. So we may be able to get to a situation where we have fundamental disagreements, but it should be cordial. And that'll make sense as we go on. So we're going to be looking, again, just as a recap, the objectives. We're going to look at a couple of introductory cases: fighting injustice, refusing to do a favor for a friend. Then we'll discuss some professions and codes and ethical standards. And then finally, we'll end up with professionalism and the law. So as we said, we're going to be looking at the definitions of what it means to be a profession. People use the word professional, profession, slash profession in informal ways. And here we'll look at some formal definitions provided by different people or different organizations. We'll see that some of the standards that will work will focus on different occupations. We'll try to focus and spend quite a bit of time on those codes associated with computing. We will look at the impact of the standards on people within the professions and also members of the general public. You will notice that sometimes the impact of a professions, you'll notice the impact the professions have on the general public. Obviously, computing, we have software engineers, people developing software. We'll focus on their actions and what they do on the job, and do they have an impact on people and the public. And we'll look at some case studies here. So to get us going, we're going to look at a couple of scenarios just to start getting us practice analyzing different situations. So the first case study that we'll spend actually quite a bit of time on is referred to as fighting injustice. Here's the background. We have a student worker, Rachel, who works part-time for IT services at her university. There's another person, Professor Page. She's a faculty member at the university. Some background on her: she is having a bad semester. This is Professor Page is having a bad semester. Her teaching isn't going well, and you know, probably things even in her personal life are not going so well. She has never really been the most popular teacher. She was a target of a particular website. This website was ZTBT, which stands for Zero Tolerance for Bad Teaching. Anyways, the members of the website start making videos that make fun of Professor Page, and particularly focusing in on her clumsiness. Apparently, Professor Page during the class would make and fumble things and maybe stumble and whatnot. So there's this small relationship between Rachel and Professor Page. Rachel has had Professor Page in class before and found her to be competent and caring. So it seems like Rachel has somewhat of a like for Professor Page. It's not a bad thing. So Rachel saw the video of Professor Page that was posted on the ZTBT website. Just keep that in mind. She saw that. Rachel, as being an IT worker, was scheduled to work on Professor Page's computer, which was completely coincidental and not really important, I guess. But Professor Page let Rachel into her office to do the work and asked her to go ahead and log her off so that she could do what she needed to do. And as Rachel sat down, she noticed an email with the subject saying, "Sorry about your diagnosis." And like anyone, was kind of curious about, what that meant, because, again, she likes Professor Page. So Rachel went a little bit beyond the being curious. She went ahead and opened the email and actually read it. And she learned that Professor Page has MS, multiple sclerosis. Obviously, at this point, Rachel knows that the video about her are no longer funny. Not sure she thought they were funny to begin with, but now she's in particularly very concerned. And so she shares this with some of her fellow classmates, and of course others want to know how Rachel knew this. So she told them that she read an email of Professor Page that explained it. Well, once, of course, her supervisor learned of this in IT services, she was promptly fired. So there are a number of questions that we will ask. In particular, we're going to start off with this first question, and you'll see this slide repeated several times. So right now, we're going to focus in on this question. And again, given that we're in an online class, I would normally ask these questions in a live class, but because we are doing this course online, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in several fictional students and their responses, and then we're going to analyze them in hopes of learning how to make your point across. Oops, sorry about that. Let me see if I can get back. Goodness. Okay. All right. So let's say that we have two students, Anne and Rita, having an exchange. Yes. So it is clear that Anne believes that Rachel was acting morally and that she was simply trying to help a person, and it isn't that what we want others to do. That's basically Anne's response. Positive things here about Anne's statement is that she clearly states her opinion. I don't think there is any ambiguity here on that. The problem with this is that what I would like to see added here is some support of what she's saying. She's not really taking into account the most likely counter argument that someone else would have. So Rita comes along and she follows up and is pretty defiant, and like Anne, there's no support for her statements. She simply says that her actions were wrong. It would be nice if there was a bit more supporting verbiage here to support her point. So again, we're doing this to help you understand that these are kind of things that we are going to hope that you guys do in our online discussions. So you're going to provide some answers, but we're looking for more verbiage than this. So this is a case where you would want to make sure that you're adding more. So here's an exchange between three students. So the first comment made by Anne is exactly as it was before, so we don't need to go over that. But Chris, I think he does a good job in establishing some common ground. He says that he does agree that Rachel was trying to help and that is something that you can't argue. Every person would want people to help. So I think he does a nice job of respecting Anne's opinion and integrating it into his own. Um, However, you can see that Chris then establishes why his opinion is different, and it has to do with privacy. So again, just repeating previously, we're looking for more support, and Chris really does do a nice job. He responds to Anne and then provides his opinion and why he provides it. Pat does a nice job in setting the stage. He says that he agrees with Chris, and he goes further to say that this is a nice clue to the listener that they're not going to rehash what Chris said. They're going to then take and add something on to that idea, because he starts off with saying, I agree. Overall, he does a nice job here. The explanation about saying that Rachel is not a bad person and links it up to Anne's feelings. Everyone understands it and is kind of siding with Rachel, and Pat is sympathetic to that, and so I think it's appropriate for him to put this here. And then in the end, he talks about why the privacy issue is particularly relevant here. So overall, I think a reasonable exchange was made between these students. So we will then ask a different question than the first one we just investigated, which was about morality. The next one is more about ethical behavior. So a little bit different here, as you saw in chapter 1, ethics is more tied to the profession. These are standards tied to the profession, and let's just look at a few of those here. Obviously, when we're looking at whether Rachel's actions were ethical, because Rachel works in IT services, there are things that are expected of professionals working in IT services. And certainly one of those is to respect privacy. And that is the case with our IT services here at Miami. We are often, not often, every year we have to sign a new confidentiality document to make sure that that our workers know that this is really important to us and that they could be fired if they didn't follow it. So in this particular situation, it was emphasized and explained to the student Rachel that she couldn't look at the file that were on the computer she was working on. She signed a document indicating so, and she eventually violated the trust of the IT people. It's pretty obvious at this point that she violated the ethical standards that she was expected to uphold, and it's safe to say she behaved unprofessionally. So the next question we're going to look at is, was Miss McFarland justified in firing Rachel? This one perhaps not a clear-cut answer. It's pretty clear that Rachel violated a situation, but is it worth firing her for this? Is really kind of the notion we want to think about. Here's a student's position. Basically, the student says McFarland was justified for firing Rachel. Rachel broke a rule and should be punished for it. Again, this would be one of those cases where we're going to be looking for more support of this. This doesn't stand on itself very well. So let's go on, see some more interactions. So here's an exchange between two students, and it goes on for several pages, and we'll analyze this. So basically, Sam, I think, does a nice job of articulating his opinion on this subject. He points out an example from the book that involves the no harm, no foul principle. That's terrific. That's exactly what we're looking for. It doesn't have to be that particular theory, but it could be just the use of any theory that supports what you're trying to say here. So he states that there needs to be more information known before we can clearly say whether or not Miss McFarland was justified in firing Rachel. We don't know if the situation caused Professor Page any pain or not. And that's kind of his no harm, no foul principle. Taylor does identify what might be the likely disagreement, and it has to do with whether Page's input is relevant here. So, yeah. So I'm just going to go ahead and put all of this here. I don't know why. So you can take some time to read that. But the follow-up exchanges, so you can think of each one of these as a pair. So Sam is saying, that people make mistakes. Yet Taylor is saying, yeah, people make mistakes, but this is not a little mistake that we can overlook. Sam is definitely on the side of Rachel, very sympathetic to her position. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's very admirable, very moral to care about people. Taylor tries to establish a common ground, agreeing with things, then is going to try and focus in on the aspects of what Sam said that Taylor disagrees with. Sam then listens to Taylor's statement and simply disagrees that just because Miss McFarland gave a break to Rachel doesn't mean that it's going to cause the IT department to fall apart. You can see that it gets kind of nasty here. Taylor then disagrees again. So we're at a point pretty much where these two just fundamentally disagree, and it gets kind of disrespectful and name calling, and this is an example of something we will not tolerate in this course. So, all right. So we have these last couple of questions here. Suppose that the student was not an IT worker, but simply a student that came in for office hours. Does that change the context of how you feel about this? And if it does, why? So think about that. And that's not too far out of the realm of a possibility. I often have students come to my office when I was on campus, and what's not so common is that I would rarely leave my computer unlocked, but I'm not gonna lie and say that it's never happened. If I'm in the middle of something and my boss interrupts me, something urgent, I may run out real quick and not even think twice about locking my computer, which is not right, but it does happen. So in this case, if Rachel had been simply a student that was in the faculty's office, would that really change your opinion? Let's go on. Again, just that's the point of that is really thinking about the context. Actually, let me back up for a second here because we didn't look at this last Professor Page. The interesting question here on whether or not Professor Page herself did something wrong. This is a question that I'm going to perhaps possibly discuss during our online session, so you should contemplate that as well and be able to explain your answer. So these last two in particular, think about in case we talk about it on our Sunday night online lecture. Okay, so we're at our second case. This case is referred to as refusing to do a favor for a friend. There are two individuals here, Mike and Greg. Mike went on a vacation snowmobiling and unfortunately got snowed in. I'll just condense this story here pretty quickly. He had an assignment he had to turn in and had no internet access up in the mountains where he was snowmobiling. And so he called his friend Greg and asked him if he would log on to the learning management system and submit his homework for him. Greg basically said no, he refused to do it. He saw that there were two situations that prevented him from being able to do this. And first one was the Code of Student Conduct. If you remember reading the story, Greg, the employee, the software engineer, was also an alumni of that same school that Michael is currently going to. So he saw that as a violation of the Code of Student Conduct. He also saw it as a violation of the Software Engineering Code of Ethics, since he would be misrepresenting himself if he were to log in under Michael's credentials. So Greg didn't do it. We're going to look at a couple of these questions during our online session this week. So I'm going to pose the questions and maybe offer up a few ideas of what's relevant, but the details we'll go over during our online session. So the first one is, did Greg do the right thing? As Michael's friend, did Greg do anything wrong? From the employee, Greg was working at a company. If he had used the company's computer to submit Michael's work, would he have done something wrong from that perspective? And the third perspective that is worth considering is, did he do something wrong as an alumni? So remember, Greg had graduated from that school. Would he have been doing something wrong if he logged into the school's LMS system using Michael's credentials? Sorry, I had to take a sip there. It is also interesting to consider the possibility of whether or not Michael was wrong in asking Greg for this favor. Going a little bit deeper, once Greg refused to do it, suppose Michael pressured him. Would that have been wrong? Taking it even further, suppose Greg cut off his friendship with Michael when Greg refused to do it. Would Michael have been wrong in this situation? Greg is no longer a student at the school. Does the University Code of Conduct apply to him now that he's not a student anymore? So Greg also cites the Software Engineers Code of Ethics that was not part of the description in the textbook. So you don't know what's in there, but should the code have included anything about situations like this? That's another question I want you to think about. And if so, what would that look like? So these are the questions you are to consider, and we will address them in our online session. So ethics, we talked about ethics in chapter 1. Basically, it's kind of things that everyone wants everyone to be doing, even if they themselves have to do it. So generally speaking, there are some things that every culture recognizes as ethical. So for example, do not hurt people, do not steal, the golden rule kind of things. So we will be talking about standards. These are the things that people should be doing. The standards will affect a particular group, and we need to understand which group we're talking about. Are we talking about physicians, plumbers, software engineers? You get the point. The importance of professional standards, in particular computing standards, cannot be understated. The general public, as you know, is affected by computers and the software that runs them. The privacy of the public, the safety of the public are all affected by software, computer hardware, and just basic computing systems. So your book talks about a couple examples, and we're going to go over them here. The Therac 25 radiation machine. Basically, people who have cancer would go to the hospital and use this machine to shoot radiation into the body at precise locations with the idea of killing the cancer. This particular machine was thought to be safe, but one particular individual, while getting the treatment, felt like she was being burned, and she screamed out in the middle of her treatment. They stopped the procedure. The technicians and nurses looked at her, but they didn't see any visible signs of any burns, so they were like, very confused. But as it turns out, she was very badly burned on the inside of her body. And it was later found out that the machine had burned a number of people. In fact, some people actually died, which is pretty horrific. And they found out that the main culprit was found to be the software in the system. The software was delivering bad doses of radiation because it had a bug. So the second example, briefly, was a technical support person was helping a woman who had called in for support, and as is often the case when you do this, the technician asked if he could take control remotely, remote control over the computer from where he was, and she agreed. And while he was there, he found some pictures about the woman's sex life, and he copied them and then reposted them to a website, which is clearly inappropriate on so many levels. And so then finally, the third example was the Toyota's recall of 100,000 Prius automobiles. There's basically something wrong with the braking system in these automobiles. And so there was a recall. And as it turns out, this went to court because some people had died from this, and they were found to not be guilty, mainly because it was a software bug that they determined was the issue, but the programmers who had developed the program were able to show clearly their testing and documentation and debugging program, and without that, had they not had that, they probably would have been held liable, basically. So that's an important piece to know here. Okay, so computer or computing professionals, either would work. People that you see, don't hear, like a system administrator. So almost every computer that is in operation has one or two or more people that are referred to as system administrators. Sometimes they are given the name super users, or sometimes they say they have root access. These people have the ability to look at any file they want, and they can change any file. These people can and do wield a lot of power. I can log into a computer system and use a program. However, it is possible that a malicious system administrator could install a rogue copy of that same program that perhaps captures my keystrokes, or potentially capturing my passwords, and I wouldn't necessarily know the difference. So they do wield a lot of power, as well as database administrators have the ability to look at the contents of all of the database records, and depending on what is in that database, it could be pretty harmful to if a bad database administrator were to go in and do something bad there. So imagine basically just sensitive information that would be scattered out throughout the databases across the world even. Basically, there's a computer code in everything. Computer code in DVD players, entertainment devices, medical devices, phones, airplanes, and so on. In this day and age, you can't hardly go, a couple of feet without having software involved in some device. So it really permeates the world, and this trend will only continue as our society becomes more technologically advanced. Okay. I don't know if you remember from chapter 1, there are, I mentioned these slides about thinking it through. While it wasn't clearly outlined in chapter 1, I did talk about it, and here's a case. The importance of professional standards, in particular computing standards, cannot be understated. I already read that. I apologize. Okay. So the thinking it through, I would like for you to list three situations in which a computer professional, either directly or indirectly, could strongly affect your life. We just went over the system administrator, the database, and goodness. Yeah, those are just the two computing professionals we talked about. I would like for you to think about that and list three situations where you can see a computer professional being able to directly or indirectly affect your life. So that kind of speaks for itself. Okay, moving on. So here's the Baylis definition of a profession. Everyone has an informal definition of a profession, but now we are going to start to look at some more formal definitions. Baylis comes along and basically says there are the must-haves, and there are three of them in order to be a profession. And a professional must have extensive training, involve significant intellectual effort, and provide an important service to society. So let's just take some simple ones. We're going to kind of put a couple professions through and see how this works. So being a doctor, the medical profession obviously requires extensive training. In most cases, well, at least here in the States, you're going to have at least 4 years of undergrad, then 4 years of medical school, at least 1 to 2 years of a residency. So that's, we're talking that's to 10 plus years of education and training. I think that would call that extensive. It also involves a serious intellectual effort. I think most people would consider going to medical school, passing medical exams, that you'd have to be pretty intellectual to be able to pull that off. So does it provide an important service to society? I think without a doubt the medical profession serves society. We have all kinds of illnesses that if we didn't have doctors treating us would go rampant, and we'd have a very sick culture. So there's just many examples of how they serve the society. So now, of course, there are other professions that we can consider that may be a bit more blurry as to how they fit here. So you have to exercise good judgment when considering this. And, you could take your own examples and put it through and see how they come out. So Baylis also then goes on to talk about three common features of a profession, and that would be certification or licensing, a member organization of other professionals in that same profession, and then having autonomy in one's work. So certification and licensing. Lawyers and doctors all have licenses that they have to have in order to be able to practice their chosen profession. Some engineers have certifications. In fact, a lot of engineers have a lot of certifications, which is often a good determiner of one's competency in a certain field. So organization of members. All professions should have an organization of members. So as an example, the medical field has the American Medical Association, the AMA. Teachers have the National Education Association, and computing professionals have the ACM and the IEEE as their organizations. So autonomy, having autonomy in one's work basically means when you're performing your work, you have some degree of flexibility in how you pursue things. The actual actions that you take on a daily basis can be flexible enough for you to be able to make your own decisions. So for example, a lawyer, when handling a case, every case is different. So they have to be able to develop their own strategy for handling each particular case. You wouldn't automatically just treat each case exactly the same. It wouldn't work. So on the other hand, somebody who works at McDonald's does pretty much the same thing every day. They have a set of instructions that they follow, and they do that over and over. So they don't really have a lot of autonomy to do or handle things differently. Okay, so we have another thinking it through here. In regards to software engineering, Texas is the one state, as of this lecture, that requires software engineers to have a license. The other 49 states do not have a requirement. It would be reasonable to ask why Texas would want this requirement for their software engineers. So I'd like for you to think about that as one of your thinking throughs. Certainly, the argument would undoubtedly have to go along these lines. Actually, I'm not going to give that to you. I just want you to, I was going to give you an example of an argument. But since I've asked the question, I'd like for you to just think about it and be prepared to talk about it. You know, think about a rationale for the lack of that requirement in other states, which is the other flip coin of that question. Okay. So update some on certification exams. So there's been an update, and you're welcome to go ahead and look at this. I encourage you to do that, especially if you happen to live in one of these states that are listed here, and you have plans to go back and do your occupation in one of those states. It would be important for you to understand those updates. Okay, so another definition of a profession, we just got done looking at BALIS, is the Good Works Project. This one is a bit broader definition that is produced at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. The project was developed to help and understand and study how young people deal with ethical problems in their profession. The Good Work Project defines a profession in a much broader way than the BALIS. So with BALIS, it was probably just a handful of professions that would qualify. But the Good Works Project is much broader, and you can read it here. Basically, we're talking about a career that has autonomy. That's similar to the BALIS. We add that it serves the public and is performed at a high level. That would match the BALIS. But because it has the extra component of serving the public, it is a broader definition. So for example, I might now say that, let's take a plumber. Under the Good Works Project, I would say that the plumber, when they come to my house, or say they help in a new building, they're installing piping, they probably do have a lot of flexibility in how they run the pipes, the size of the pipes, and the decision where what materials they want to use, etc. So no doubt that the plumbers serve the public. Without them, we'd be, oh, I was going to use a bad word, but I'll refrain. Anyway, it'd be a mess. And there are plumbers that are, you know, better than other plumbers, so we can distinguish between higher level services of what one plumber offers versus another. If we had taken the occupation of a plumber and analyzed it under BALIS, it is unlikely that we would have arrived at the decision that plumbing is a profession. But the Good Works Project does allow that. So, thinking it through, I'd like you to consider whether the weather person on your television channel is a professional, according to either the BALIS or the Good Works Project. So be prepared to talk about that. That will help me understand that you're getting the difference between these two. Now we're going to see a third one, which is Kulchin's Wheel of Attributes of Professions. And clearly, this one is way more extensive than the first two we just looked at. Kulchin has 20 different attributes that he lists. the first 16 are considered required elements and the last 4 are not. So let's just look at a few. Number 3 requires passing an exam, and number 2 requires extensive education, and number 1, I'm not sure why I went in that order particularly, it doesn't matter. But number 1 involves a skill based upon a theoretical foundation. I'm going to back up here. We'll get here in a second. So this has a lot more attributes than Baylis, and of course a good works project. And so the idea is we're to evaluate professions in the 16 or 20 different attributes. And what I'd like you to do is, let's remember that number 1 is based on skill, number 2 is extensive education, and number 3 is the exam. Okay. So what Kultgen does is he puts these attributes on a wheel. And you have an example here that we're going to look at. So the spokes, let me see if I can get my little pointer here. These are this would be the number 1 attribute, which was the skill-based. Number 2 was the education, and number 3 was the exam, and so on. So he only lists the 16 because of the required. This outer circle is considered to be, if you think of for just a moment, the outer wheel, if you get all the way up here, is considered to be a 1. Here at the center is considered to be 0, so this is probably 0.5. And what you need to do in this case is you take a profession and you look at each attribute and you decide based on like what that profession is. Does it require a lot of skill? Does it require passing an exam or a lot of education, or does it passing an exam, and so on? And so you chart these dots, and again, you're to do that by gauging the level. So in this case, we're looking at law. This appears to be about, I don't know, 0.75, maybe 0.7. If it, required a lot, you'd see it all the way up here on the 1, and that's the point. So you chart these dots on these spokes, and then you draw the lines to form this polygram. And the notion is that anything beyond this 0.5 circle shows that it's a profession, and anything in here that would come inside the circle would be more of a non-profession occupation. Okay, so let's go on and do a, let me see, I've got to get out of my pen here, and look at an example. So, teaching. As we analyze the teaching occupation for spoke 1, which you recall corresponds with attribute 1, which is skill-based on a theoretical foundation, I gave that about a 0.85, it looks to be. Doesn't really matter, it doesn't have to be precise. But I did that because absolutely teaching is a skill based on a theoretical foundation. However, it's not all theoretical. There's an art to teaching, and so I kind of wanted to compensate for that and just list that here. 2, does the profession require extensive education? And in many states, you you may be able to teach with a bachelor's degree, but many states are moving to a minimum of having a master's. So that would be like 6 years of school. So I would say that's extensive, and you do have to pass a teaching exam. So you get the idea of what I'm talking about. You list these scores, and then you start to connect the dot. And if we did this around the spoke, we'd end up with a polygram and be able to tell that yes, in fact, this is a profession. Okay. So thinking it through. So now we have three mechanisms in order to decide whether an occupation is considered a profession or a non-professional occupation. What I'd like for you to do is to consider the occupation of a software engineer, and using Colchin's wheel, make the argument that software engineering is or is not a profession. Okay, pretty simple on that. So as a quick reminder, we've looked at the three definitions of professionalism: the Baylis Good Works Project and the Colchin's wheel. We are now going to look at a fourth one, which is proposed by Davis. The idea of the profession is that a profession is a group of individuals who are trying to earn a living by serving some moral ideal. A moral ideal is a state of affairs that want everyone to try and achieve. It may not be possible to achieve that, but we want them to try and achieve it. One way to say we want people to try to achieve this is we're willing to reward or assist or give a pat on the back for people who do try to achieve this ideal. So, for example, being a mobster would not be considered a profession here, because we would never reward a mobster for doing their job, because it usually involves killing or hurting and things like that. So, okay. So a couple of outcomes of Davis's definition are that a code of ethics is required in order for something to be a profession. It's impossible to teach professionalism without a code of ethics. And it's impossible to understand without such a code. So the first three bullets here are all kind of lead up to the importance of a professional code. And of course, the last bullet says it all. No code of ethics, then no profession. Some other aspects that come out of Davis's is that a profession puts the profession first. Their professional code comes first, basically is it. So if there were conflict between the code and an employer, the code would always take precedence. What this means is that a code of ethics, if accepted by a profession, can be an important independent enforcement. So, for example, the code of ethics that we have in computing, there are two of them, as I mentioned earlier, the ACM code of ethics and there's a joint ACM IEEE code of ethics. And there's nothing that binds computing professionals from actually following this. As such, there is no enforcement mechanism. Now, there is a small enforcement mechanism in that if you are found to be grossly violating the rule, you could be tossed out of the organization and have your membership revoked. But that's not the same as the other enforcement I was talking about a minute ago. So nonetheless, these codes, once established, can provide useful service even without having an enforcement mechanism. So another thinking it through. Does teaching qualify as a profession under any of the definitions we have looked at thus far? If so, which definitions and what attributes of teaching makes it qualify as a profession? Conversely, if not, what parts of the definition does teaching not meet? Let's take the Good Works project. Does teaching look like a profession under this definition? I think if you remember just a few slides ago, we started to do that, and it certainly was appearing to be the case. But I still would like for you to look at that and kind of work around the attributes on all 16 of them. Now for the other two, the Bayliss and the Davis definition, this requires a bit more introspect, and we will address those on our weekly videos. Okay. So there are some terms here that you can see them here in italics. They are ethical standards and rules. So let's just talk about these. Ethical standards, these are rules or principles or ideals, and we're going to lump all of these things into just what we refer to as ethical standards. So for example, a rule is simply things that we must do. They are obligations or things that we must do. They are obligations or things that we can't do. So it goes both ways. They're just rules. So there are two organizations that you ought to be aware of, which I've mentioned several times now, the IEEE and the ACM. Actually, I didn't mean to do that. I apologize. Back. So these are the two organizations that, for example, myself, I consider important in my line of profession as a teacher first. Well, actually, a teacher second, but as a senior level administrator in IT, I subscribe to these professions and find them to be good standards to follow. So, the IEEE is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. It does sound a lot like engineering organization, but they have since evolved it to include computing and computer science. Probably the most noteworthy organization is the Association of Computing Machinery, that's the ACM. Both of these organizations have been around for many decades, and they both represent the software engineers, computer science, and people in computing occupations. There are two codes of ethics that come from these bodies. There is what's referred to as the ACM Code of Ethics, and they have rules that kind of look like this. As an ACM member, I will honor property rights, including copyrights and patents. There are many other rules that we will see in detail a bit later, so that will come. But then there's a jointly defined code, as I mentioned, the ACM IEEE, and the rules will look different than what was up here. So here's an example rule. Those managing software engineers shall, as appropriate, not punish anyone for expressing ethical concerns about a project. So a little bit different, but you get the idea. The ideals are goals that are inherently good to achieve. Some ideals you may not be able to achieve. Some ideals you may not be able to achieve. So for example, an ideal that a software engineer might try to achieve is satisfying all users of my software. Now, it may not be possible to satisfy all users of your software, but nonetheless, it is a good thing to try and achieve, even if it's impossible. So here's an example from Swedish trade unions and computer professionals. Computer professionals develop systems that use technology in a way as to satisfy the interest of the user. So that would be an ideal, trying to satisfy the interest of the user. Of course, no matter what you produce, if the system is complicated, it may not satisfy the interest of all the users. Principles are things that are consistently maintained. However, there can be contingency reasons why you wouldn't want to maintain them. Sometimes they are mitigating circumstances that would make it impossible to maintain every principle. So as we said, here are the two codes. In this slide, there are actually links to them. I think it would be good for you to uh, take a good review of both of these sites, be very familiar with them. Just You probably have already seen this, but these two codes also are listed in the appendices in the back of your book. In case you can't, for some reason, you get stuck in a snowstorm like Mike. You can look at your book. Anyway, being silly here. So the ACM Code of Ethics, there are 4 top-level categories. When looking at, for example, general and moral imperatives, not immoral, sorry, general and moral imperatives. That was a slip there. When you read the things in this section, they'll tend to be fairly generic things about honesty and not being deceitful and that type of thing. That would make sense. The more specific things to computing would be in sections 2 and 3, where you'll start to see some things that are more technically related. So as you see here in section 1, there is a rule called 1.5, honor property rights, including we just went over that one. And for each of these, ACM provides a bit more verbiage, but I think we can kind of get a general understanding here. And pretty much I can imagine almost any professional code, the code for mechanical engineers, the code for computer engineers, they all have similar qualities to this one. So when you look at, say, section 2, in particular 2.7, improve public understanding of computing and its consequences, there's some more verbiage here that describes it, but you can kind of get the idea that this is now starting to be a bit more specific to computing. Now, what I would like you to do is to have read through the ACM Code of Ethics. The homework will ask you some specific questions, but I think it's also important for you to read them. Kind of think about each one. What does it mean? Maybe think of a scenario about each item, and toward that end, what I would like you to do is read Rule 2.8 from this code. Now, if you remember, we had the friend Mike asking Greg for a favor. What I'd like you to do is read Rule 2.8 and determine whether or not Greg would have violated that rule if he had done what Michael had asked him. This will be something that we'll talk about in our online session. So read the rule, formulate an idea, and be prepared to discuss this during our online session if you're called upon. The second code that we'll talk about is the one that is jointly developed by the ACM and the IEEE. Here we have 8 top-level sections. There are about 80 total rules in this code. Probably like, yeah, 80, that's a lot of rules. Each section, some have 8, some have 6. But go out and have a look. So here's a couple of examples. 2.05 has to be about confidentiality and privacy of information that you gain during your work. Clearly, this one would have applied to Rachel and Professor Page. So, for example, let's say you're working with a company that had some confidential trade secrets. This is another example. Maybe they have special algorithms that they're developing. Certainly, you would not want to divulge that information to anybody, even your family. 3.10, you would ensure adequate testing and debugging. Remember the Toyota Prius case we just talked about? That's one of the reasons they didn't get cited, was because they did do that well. Um, 4.04 talks about deceptive financial practices, double billing, and so on. Um, so an example here, I once had a colleague who was a contractor, and he was doing work. He had several clients, and he was doing work for two clients that had similar requirements, and he felt as a professional that he could not use any of the same code from one of the clients to the other client. That certainly was his opinion. I don't know that I think it would be unethical to use the same code because, as an example here at Miami, we often have snippets of code in many of our applications that serve the same thing. For example, um, our authentication system is involved in many applications. So anyway, I think you get the point. So, continuing on about the two codes, it's important to note that there is no priority between the codes. So, for example, you do not say this is the most important one, this is the second most important one, and so on. They're basically unordered. Now, this can cause a problem because sometimes you may be in a situation that conflicts with one code or another. And so professionals have to try very hard to think about the different situations. And that's why the analysis that we do in this course is important. So I'm going to bring up actually, I'm not going to do that because this is such a long lecture. You need to make sure that you look very carefully over the two codes of ethics. And as a reminder, they are in the back of your book. Okay, so here's a question, and it's a trick question. So the scenario is, let's say we have a professional that has a client, and the professional has learned that the client has bribed a government official. The question is, should the professional notify the authorities on the bribing situation? Um, Again, the trick question, the reason it's a trick question is because the answer is it depends. There's just not a simple yes or no. In this case, it depends. So it depends on the profession. For example, if you're a lawyer and your client happens to be the person who is suspected of committing the crime, the lawyer has a duty not to divulge that information based on the attorney-client privilege. On the other hand, if an engineer learned of this, maybe there was some deal made to build a bridge, then the engineer would have to report the information. So obviously the ethics and the standards differ by profession. Here we have a similar situation that would be handled differently depending on your profession. Some other examples: the law does not allow a physician or lawyer, for that matter, to testify against their client. A reporter, this is a little less solidified, but a reporter in some states doesn't have to reveal their sources. In some states they do. The federal court, on the other hand, requires reporters to reveal their sources. So point here is that it really does depend on the profession. Okay, so another thinking it through. So let's take the lawyer case where the lawyer has to keep the confidence of the clients. And you could probably argue that that is moral, and you could probably argue that it's not moral. Again, no right or wrong. So attacking the moral thing first. Guessing that any argument on this certainly has to be on the side of the suspected criminal, where a lawyer has to defend that person. And if a lawyer did not keep that information confidential and maybe divulged it because the lawyer thought it was okay to divulge, it would compromise the client's and the suspected criminal rights. So, from the perspective, you would have to say that any one of us could potentially be in the same spot through false incrimination, coincidence, and whatnot. So, I guess the point here is, and you'll see this many times throughout this course, is that you really have to look at context, context, context. and flip your initial response to how you feel about something. Flip it and look at the other side. So from that perspective, you would have to say that any one of us could potentially be in the same spot through false incrimination, coincidence, and whatnot. And perhaps we all want our suspected criminals to have attorney-client privilege. That is the only way that they can get the best possible defense. So in the end, we would want that for ourselves is basically it. So on the other hand, you could probably argue that it's not morally permissible. For example, let's suppose some lawyer knows for certain that somebody has committed a crime and that certain details are known about the crime. I know many folks would argue that they would want the lawyer to divulge that information to get the criminal off the street and make society a better and safer place to live. So that would be the argument that you would have to make. And that is that would the world be better off by the attorney divulging that information? Okay? So just to sum this up, you're to give the strongest argument you can as to how such a rule is either morally permissible or is not morally permissible. So here's a famous case involving an attorney. Take a sip of coffee here. So in this case, the client did tell the lawyer who was convicted of murder where one of his victims was. And of course, the victim's family wanted to know where that was because they'd never found their loved one, and they wanted to give them perhaps a proper burial or whatever. It's not unusual for loved ones wanting to be reconnected even through death. So, obviously this is a very emotional situation. I can't imagine, but from what I see, it is almost universal that once a loved one is lost, it's extremely important for the family to recover the body. And I fortunately have never been in that situation, but it's obviously clear that it's really important for families to do this. And as such, I have huge sympathy towards the families, and I would certainly want them to be able to recover the bodies of their loved ones if that's possible. So in this particular case, the attorney would not divulge the information. The attorney was citing the attorney-client privilege and said that they were not going to do it. It turned out that a waiver was granted from the ethics board for lawyer, but the lawyer still did not divulge the information. So here's the question that is posed here. Now, the attorney decided not to divulge the location of the body, and it kind of hurts me a little bit in that I would like the family to recover the body, and I can point my finger and say, yes, the attorney is acting in an immoral way. They should just do and provide the location. That certainly is one response I could give. But let's assume that the lawyer in their mind believes that they're doing the moral thing for their client. And in fact, they may be doing the moral thing. They may think that all clients need to know that their attorney maintains attorney-client privilege under all circumstances, not just, ones that you can pick and choose. So I get that too. And so on a little exercise here, it's always good and I mentioned this just a little bit ago, to flip your first gut response and think about it from a different perspective. That way you'll get a much broader perspective and understanding of this, and And that's really what we're trying to do here. It's, your first gut reaction should not just be your answer always. Okay. Um, so one little exercise here that I'd like you to do, and it's always good, and that is to do exactly that. Um, make the strongest case you can that her decision was moral, and the strongest decision you can that it was immoral. All right. I'm just going to skip through that. It's just a mechanism for you to help organize your thoughts. It's not critical. We've got a lot to go over here. Uh, so here's another case. We have a new software developer named Chandler. Um, he just got out of college and he's working on this particular project. The boss of the project has been with the company for 20 years, has a lot of experience, of course. Um, so we have a new guy and someone who's been here with a lot of experience. The first assignment that Chandler was given, he was asked to develop some code. His code used something that was already developed, and he discovered while doing this that the code meets minimum requirements, but not the preferred ones. So obviously Chandler would like to meet all of them, not just the minimum. He wants to do the preferred as well. And for those of you who may not have extensive software engineering background, let me just give you an example. Let's say that we have some code that sorts certain transactions in a bank account by the date, and it takes 1 second to run. For many people, that might be good enough, but for other people or clients, it may need to be faster. So the question is, should we spend our time improving it, or should we just leave it alone because it's good enough? Chandler wants to develop a new software library that he believes would fix the problem. In other words, he believes he could reach this new level of performance and doesn't think it would take long to do so. And just a word of caution here, many of us developers always think it won't take very long and often find our thinking is not always spot on. But at any rate, of course, Chandler's boss doesn't agree, and so he says, no, we're going to keep it as it is, and you're to document the higher degree of precision. You're to document that the higher degrees of precision are impractical at this time because of time and budget. So the software does work, and it does meet minimum specs. So as is, it's good enough. It can't harm people. In other words, it does what it should do. It's obvious that Chandler has found a way to improve the product. He's going to use some newer methods, and it is very possible that the boss is less technically capable because he hasn't kept up with the newer trends in the software. So, in other words, Chandler may have fresher ideas and know more about the newer technology. But the boss is more capable in project management. He knows what it's like to um, have to complete projects on time, on budget, and has many years of experiences of how that doesn't always come easily. So he's doing his part. Um, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take some of the rules from the ACM IEEE and kind of look at this particular case. So Rule 3.01 talks about striving for high quality, acceptable cost, and a reasonable schedule while ensuring that significant trade-offs are clear and accepted by the employer and the client. How does a developer ensure that significant trade-offs are clear and accepted by the employer and the client? Well, one way is in the documentation of the code. Chandler could and should document that there is a better way to do this code that would improve performance. Rule 3.05 talks about ensuring that an appropriate method is used for any project that you undertake. So in this scenario, Chandler believes there is a more appropriate method, while Chandler's boss believes the current method is appropriate enough. Rule 3.11 talks about adequate documentation, which we just talked about when we were discussing how to capture the trade-offs described in Rule 3.01. And finally, Rule 4.01 talks about tempering all technical judgment by the need to support and maintain human values. So in this scenario, Chandler should probably not go above the boss's head and rewrite the code with what he feels is a more appropriate method, unless, of course, he discovers that there is some life-threatening issue with the current code. But he should document how he believes a more appropriate, newer method can be used to make the software more efficient should the client want to improve the performance down the road. That's the appropriate kind of response here. Okay, so another thinking it through. So now that I've outlined several of the points of this scenario, and as a reminder, we are talking about whether or not Chandler should go above the boss's head. Let's assume that Chandler discovers that there is a bug in the code that could put people's lives at stake. But Chandler's boss has continued to make it very clear that we are staying the course with the current methodology. What I'd like for you to do is review the other rules in the joint ACM IEEE Code of Ethics to determine if there is anything that speaks to whether Chandler should go to a higher authority regarding differences between him and his boss. We will discuss this during our online chapter review this week, so be prepared, as is the same with the other thinking throughs. Okay, so we have these two computing codes. Both of them are not a basis for profession according to Davis's definition. Davis's definition required that groups of individuals were openly following some moral idea. The truth is that most computer professionals here in the US are not familiar with the rules of other codes. Some of them may be aware of them, but maybe they'll subscribe to all of the codes. So further, there is no particular reason to accept the ACM code as being the appropriate one for people to follow. There are some problems with the ACM code. Actually, all codes probably have situations, both in particular, this one has unclear situations. Some of it is perhaps due to the software engineering being a relatively young discipline. So when you think about computing, say kind of that the computing really has come in to its own in the 50s and the 60s. So that discipline is really this discipline is only really 60 to 70 years old. And in the grand scheme of things, that's pretty young when you compare it to other disciplines such as mathematics, astronomy, and other activities. Computer science and software engineering is pretty young. So the ACM code has some inclusions about some moral imperatives, like avoid harm to others, where you can say there's negative consequences. Either there's a loss of life, loss of possible information, lost property, etc. So I think when we say harm, we're not talking about necessarily physical harm. We're talking about all types of harm: physical, financial, mental, everything, so on. So here is an example situation. Let's say that we have a programmer that is working for the military, for the U.S. military, and they're working on a target identification, and they want to have armed robots working on cyber war strategies. So the task is to inherently hurt people or organizations. We want to cause loss of information. So here we would, if we had armed robots, the task would be to physically hurt things or people. Cyber war, we'd be interested in disrupting electronic operations. So in either case, the person we're trying to cause harm. So kind of intrinsic in what they were doing was a concept of harming. The question is, does this violate the ACM moral imperative? Should the programmer stop working on the project? So whether or not the person should be stopping the project, I think we ought to look at the code a little more deeply. And I think that the code actually is intended for something like The Prius case we just reviewed, but um, so if you're working on a piece of software that is supposed to do some task, such as like help stop a car, and you knew that the software was faulty and could hurt somebody, but yet you let the software be deployed, I believe that's what we're really looking at here. But we're going to go on. Another thinking it through. So here is some other questions to think through. Let's just take the general moral imperative of respect the privacy of others. What I would like for you to do is identify problematic situations where it is tough to or unclear whether or not you are following this correctly. So when you try to do this, you should try to think of situations where the objective of respecting privacy cannot be met. Think of a situation where the whole task is to invade privacy. You should be ready to discuss this in our online session. Okay. Becoming a professional. So what is the process of becoming a professional? When you look at lawyers and physicians, they often have a specific event that marks this achievement. For example, lawyers have to pass the bar exam and physicians have to pass the medical exam. In computing, there is really no singular event that denotes this. So when I became a computing professional, it actually is hard to pinpoint. Was it when I was in my undergraduate program, my master's program, or when I got my first computing job? It's really hard to say. Um, what we like to promote is it's when you start following the codes of conduct that are expected um, as a hallmark for this event. So, all right, we're going to look at another case. This case involves a system manager who discovers while working on the dean's computer that the dean's hard drive is filled with a bunch of pornographic videos. The dean requested support because his computer had become so slow in performance. Upon discovery of these large video files, the system manager realized that that's largely what was probably causing the performance lag. What the systems manager did was he opened up one of the files and discovered that they were pornographic. So at this point, he's the systems manager, he or she, doesn't really say who, it really has three possible options in front of them, and that is to confront the dean and demand that he delete the files, report the matter to the provost, or transfer the files and improve the performance and do nothing else. So I would like for you to reflect on this case and decide which option the systems manager should choose and why. You need to take into consideration whether or not the system manager had any right to look at the files to begin with and where that fits into the options that you choose. Then I would like for you to change the scenario a bit and assume that the files that are causing the problems are not pornographic in nature, but are rather the dean's videos of his vacations with his family. Does that alter your choice on how you would handle this? And it may be helpful to use this little grid here. But either way, be prepared to talk about this. Okay. As we come to the end of this chapter, we close with some summary and tying this all together. So the ACM and the ACM IEEE are the best known codes for software engineering and computing scientists in the United States. Computer professionals are not licensed by law, except for software engineers who practice in the state of Texas. The Good Works Project has the least restrictive definition of a professional. The Culchin and his wheel of attributes includes the most attributes. And Michael Davis relates most directly to our interest in ethical responsibility of professionals. So as a recap for our online expectations, you need to go back through this lecture. Make sure you're prepared to discuss all of the thinking throughs and other examples I mentioned that might come up in the online discussion. Okay, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you on Sunday.